Hi there, and thank you for joining me for today's live reading of Necrosis by C.L. Schneider, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Raspy sounds of hunger pushed from her rotted throat, washing over me with the smell of old blood and things long dead. I didn't understand how breath still rattled in her lungs, how her vocal cords, exposed and moldy, were still capable of producing noise, a terrible, wet, scraping that was so far from human, so far from her. My mother had a sweet voice in life, melodic, powerful, when she wanted it to be. Her songs were one of my sharpest memories as a child. They were the soundtrack of my youth. Everyone used to say, Bridget could have made it big. If she didn't have 4 kids, 2 jobs, and a husband who cared more for drinking than working. Now she'll never sing again. For some reason, the thought struck me harder than the look of her gray, decomposing flesh and patchy hair, sporadic clumps of white strands matted and darkened with bloody tissue. Beside me, my daughter screamed with all the gusto of a 9-year-old whose world had fallen apart. Her gaze darted from the horror inching toward us in the dining room to the real-time carnage of my boyfriend's death happening in the kitchen, and she screamed louder. I put a hand over her mouth, silencing the high-pitched dinner bell before it carried into the street and brought more of the undead in through the busted front door. "Shh, Lila, please," I whispered. "You know better." She nodded, tears streaming, and I removed my hand. Her shoulders shrugged in a fast, heavy breath. "Grandma," it was all she could get out before burying her face in my leg. I peeled Lila off me and shoved her toward the bathroom. "In there. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Go." Lila hurried off, messy, brown ponytail bouncing as her short legs carried her down the hall and into the bathroom. The door closed, locked. I imagined her hiding in the bathtub, curled up in a ball, clutching the dirty, ladybug-covered backpack she hadn't put down since we left home. I raised the tire iron in my grip and vowed, as I had 100 times, to do whatever was necessary to protect her. Lila was the only good thing I'd ever done in my life. We shouldn't have brought her here, I thought, watching my mother's bloated jaw snapping involuntarily, searching for a meal. My stare darted to the body in the kitchen, blood-soaked and twitching as the mindless fiends bent over my boyfriend, devouring him alive. It's too much. It's all too much. No child should have to see what we've all become. We should have gone to the country like Rusty wanted. There's too many in the city. Coming home was a mistake. The outbreak was too widespread for an old, wheelchair-dependent woman with a bad hip to survive on her own. If I'd gotten here sooner. But there were too many states between us, and with the roads clogged and gas scarce, and wandering bands of the undead everywhere, the trip became painfully long. My mother couldn't run, couldn't fight. But I let wishes override common sense and convinced myself she'd be here, barricaded in, alive and well. Maybe with Mr. and Mrs. Hitchens next door, or the Walker family on the corner. It was a close-knit neighborhood. Everyone looked after each other, particularly her, after my father left. Yet, in my heart, I knew better. I knew I'd find her stricken with the virus, holed up in the dusty rooms of the ramshackle house I grew up in. I knew what she'd look like, flesh disintegrating and mind gone. I knew what I'd have to do. I'd seen, and killed, enough of the ravage these last 4 months to be prepared. Except, I wasn't. Her sallow, blood-stained eyes, once a soft brown, locked on me, not with the love of a mother, but with the malice of a starving predator. Her bloated fingers, tips torn down to the nail bed, dug into the floor as she crawled toward me. She wouldn't stop unless I stopped her. The infected were strong beyond reason, strong and stubborn. I needed a new weapon, something quick. Bludgeoning my own mother with a tire iron until her skull caved wasn't a memory I wanted. I had options. My boyfriend's gun on the floor, the butcher knife on the counter in the kitchen, both were mere steps away from the slaughter, but still reachable. The undead consumed a fresh meal with focus and frenzy. They wouldn't look up unless I gave them a reason. If I keep my distance, move quick, and stay quiet. Okay, I can do this. Move. But I didn't. Instead, I stood and sobbed, with my heart racing and my lungs forgetting how to work, my body frozen in fear, like it had so many times under this roof. Not now. Please, God, not now. I hadn't suffered a panic attack in years. It was a complication I hadn't considered when I convinced Rusty to bring me home. It wasn't a difficult persuasion. Being a mama's boy, he understood how badly I needed to know if mine was alive, dead, or one of them. The woman had been my only guiding light, my shelter from the storm for many years, if there was even a chance she was still alive. Yet, being here again, with the same family pictures staring at me, the same peeling paint, dented walls, worn yellow curtains, and scuffed furniture, the same clutter of knickknacks no one had looked at or moved for decades, came with a rush of unwelcome memories, and I was suddenly no longer a woman, forced to grow up fast in a world that owed her nothing. I wasn't the desperate young mother who'd learned how to kill to keep her daughter safe. I was someone I hadn't been in a long time. The little girl hiding in her room while Dad punched holes in the wall. The child who watched her 3 older brothers lose their way, one after the other. The insecure, troubled teen, the submissive mouse whose sense of self grew dull and worn with each passing season, fading like the sun-bleached daisies decorating the kitchen wallpaper. Just like my mother. It was the last thing she wanted for me. Dead-end jobs and shitty apartments, the overbearing boyfriend with a bad temper, one in a line of many, bounce checks, food stamps, black eyes, and track marks. Some would say I was destined for it, but not her. Even after Lila was born and single motherhood pushed me deeper into the hole, my mother never gave up on me. Every year on my birthday, Bridget Keller would lament her own choices and try to open her daughter's eyes. When we were together, I'd blow out my candles, then she'd hug me and whisper in my ear. If we weren't, she'd call me on the phone and impart the same advice. Don't be like me, Amy girl. Be brave. Be strong. Don't let the world keep you down. Live your dreams while you can, or you'll be buried with them. Now she'd never speak those wise words again. I shouldn't care so much. I never listened to her. I never learned how to be brave or strong. I didn't climb up and out like she wanted. I fell back, lower even than her, and was steadily dragging my daughter down with me. But not anymore, I thought. Not since the virus struck. The world was reset. Sins were washed away. We were all on the same level now. We all had one shared goal: survival. I fixated on it, giving my racing thoughts a singular focus: Lila. I pictured her bright eyes, her smiling face, and my breathing quieted. My pulse slowed, and reality hurled itself in my face with a wet rip as my mother's bare foot snagged on a nail in the floorboard. She didn't notice the separation as a strip of putrid flesh tore loose. Pain meant nothing to those claimed by the virus. She just kept coming in some robotic attempt to reach me, uttering harsh, screeching sounds, dragging her broken legs over the floor, a bullet in her shoulder, a hammer sticking out of one thigh. When we got here, she was upright, shuffling awkwardly about on her bad hip, propped up by an increased strength and a loss of physical sensation. Shattering her bones was my boyfriend's attempt to protect me as she lunged unexpectedly for my face. It was his last act before the others found their way in off the street and commanded his attention. Rusty shot 4 in the head before he tripped and lost the gun. Then the rest dragged him to the kitchen floor. Run, I thought, grab Lila and run out the back. There was nothing I could do for him. Fingers and teeth were in his stomach. Life was draining rapidly out, flowing like spilled wine across the linoleum. Rusty screamed, choking on his own blood as he begged for them to stop. His pleading eyes held mine over top of their bobbing heads, and I should have been horrified. I wanted to be. We were together 10 months before the virus broke out. Lately, that was a record for me. And Rusty was good to Lila from the beginning. I had to give him that much. He gave us a roof over our heads when we had none, food, clothes, a smidge of stability. Then we had some good times. He even said he loved me once. Then he lost his job, his license, and nearly his life, all in one night. The DWI wasn't his first. Rusty still blamed it, and everything else wrong with his life, on me. And maybe it was my fault. I asked him to pick me up from work that night. He ended up in the hospital instead. When he walked out, he was a different man. Distant, angry, resentful. It was clear he had room in his heart for one thing: painkillers. 2 months later, I was squirreling away tip money for Lila and me to get out of town. I had it all planned out. We'd buy a couple of bus tickets and head across country to some new place, somewhere we could start over. I was only a few bucks short when the outbreak started. I couldn't leave Rusty then. I knew the asshole could protect us better than I could. He'd teach me to shoot. He'd get me home. He'd keep Lila alive. So I let him put his hands on me a little longer in exchange. Now, as I watched his blood lather the face of the Nameless, all I could think was, you never stopped when I begged. Leaving Rusty to his end, I refocused on my mother. Shit! My preoccupation had cost me. She was closer now. I backed up, slamming into the hutch behind me. The sudden impact rattled my grandmother's dishes. 4 delicate rose-trimmed place settings resting on the shelves, unmoved and undusted my entire life. A teacup slipped off and shattered on the floor. Before the infection, my mother would have been devastated. Now, the loss didn't even register. Her complete fixation on me was a sign. The easy meal was on the floor. It's what they always went for first. Like carrion birds, the instinct called, and the undead followed. Not until they had their fill would they turn on the ones who could still fight back, like me. If my mother had crossed over into the final stage, she would have gone after Rusty like the others did. I was wrong. There's still life in her. It was no more than a fragment, a lingering tiny piece of her disintegrating humanity, blindingly pushing her closer, driving her to kill the one thing a morsel of her subconscious still recognized: me. If I was here a day or even hours sooner, there would have been more. Enough that I might have been able to say goodbye. Because it didn't happen like in the movies. It didn't start with corpses crawling from their graves or sitting up on morgue tables. This wasn't some biblical condemnation, a demonic spell, or toxic waste dump reanimating the dead. A simple virus mutated in an unexpected way to aggressively kill off living cells and tissue, rapidly decomposing previously healthy people, decaying us bit by bit, systematically relieving us of flesh and memories until we became something else. By the time the scientists understood what was happening, the number of infected was too great to contain. A single bite transmitted the virus. The time frame of each stage varied from person to person. The first effects could be felt within minutes or hours. Heightened strength and senses, emotional instability, hyperactivity, a steady decrease in physical sensations. Then, decomposition. Aggression set in as the rotting progressed. Reason was lost. Organs ceased functioning. Most deteriorated into a feral animal within 36 to 48 hours. Some fought the battle longer, some lost sooner. After that was the final stretch, the slide into death and reanimation that abolished all traces of human consciousness. One moment a part of you was clinging to the label of mother, daughter, or grandfather, able to remember a line from your favorite song, the taste of ice cream, the birth of your child, your first kiss. The next, there was only instinct and hunger. Mommy! My gaze snapped to the side at Lila's call. I was taking too long. What's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? Because I'm weak. I've always been weak. If I didn't act soon, the heads bowed over Rusty would lift. Their glassy eyes would see me and label me as their next meal. There were too many for me to defeat alone. If they overpowered me, there would be nothing to keep them off Lila but an old, thin bathroom door. She couldn't climb out. The window inside was boarded up like all the others in the house. She was too small and lacked the tools to pull off the boards alone. Bloody fists would pound relentlessly on the door. Their combined weight would press and slam, and they'd push their way through. It will all end here, in the house I grew up. The house I still had nightmares about. It will all end because I choked, standing here cowering in fear like I did then. Except then it was only me. Now there was Lila. I tightened my grip on the tire iron and took one last look at what used to be my mother. I'm sorry. I raised the weapon above my head and brought it down on her skull over and over, bashing until it caved and her twitching body went limp. Breathless, refusing to look at what splattered the front of me, I stepped around the remains. I raced over and grabbed the gun lying in the threshold between the kitchen and the living room. Rusty's backpack was a foot away, his body and those devouring it 4 feet. I almost left, but his backpack was full of food. He and Lila had been emptying the cabinets when I found my mother in the bedroom. I opened the door. I let her out. It was my fault. My crying brought Lila running in from the kitchen. Her screams brought the horde in from outside. Now Rusty was gone, and my mother's brains were on the dining room floor. Guilt later, survive now. It was a thing Rusty said a few days back when I caught him stealing off a family who'd taken their own lives. I hated him for rummaging through their supplies, hated that it was necessary, but I understood, better than I ever wanted to. I tucked the gun in my jeans, ignoring the chewing and slurping on the other side of the counter. Pinching my nose against the smell of their rot and his blood, I tiptoed to the backpack. Seizing it, I retraced my steps out of the kitchen and ran to the bathroom. "Lila," I said in a loud whisper, "open the door." A second later, the lock clicked. I opened it, and she backed away, her hands wrapped tight around the straps of her ladybug backpack. Tangled curls pulled loose from the rubber band at her neck hid much of her tear-stained face. She looked at me through the dark snarls, and a familiar thought crossed my mind. The poor girl has my hair. I flashed her a quick smile, grabbed her arm, and hauled her up. "We have to go." "What about Rusty?" "It's just us now, baby." I took Lila's hand and pulled her into the hall. I kept her in front of me, shielding her from the carnage as best I could as we moved through the living room to the back door. I peered out into the afternoon light, muted by heavy, dark clouds. Plastic furniture with sun-worn cushions occupied the square of overgrown yard outside. The back gate leading to the alley swung open and closed in the wind. A storm was coming. So are they, I thought, as something clattered in the house behind us. We rushed outside and I pulled the door closed. I considered going back and shooting the ones inside, but there was no need to waste the bullets. Rusty's attackers no longer possessed the fine motor skills required to turn the doorknob. By the time they beat the door down or managed to wander back out the front, we'd be long gone. I put the tire iron in Lila's grip. "Hold on tight and swing for the knees as hard as you can. I showed you before, remember?" I waited for her to nod. "They won't feel the pain, but if you bust a kneecap, it'll slow them down." I bent and placed a kiss on her forehead. "I'm sorry. About Grandma. About everything." "It's not your fault." Forcing back a sudden rush of tears, I drew Rusty's gun from my jeans. I wasn't as good a shot as he was, certainly not with a moving target, but I only had to keep them back long enough to reach the truck. And then what? I wondered, as we descended the porch stairs to the yard. I had no idea. I hadn't thought past coming home. Rusty was the one with a plan. Some cabin in the woods that belonged to his uncle. Even if I knew where it was, it wouldn't matter. The man was a conspiracy nut. Living off the grid in the middle of nowhere, with no TV or internet, growing his own food because the government used dye to track and sterilize us. Crazy, old Uncle Kevin would never let me in. I was a stranger showing up at his front door in the zombie apocalypse. If he even knows what's happening. Rusty said the man hadn't left home or communicated with the outside world in years. A little envious at the thought, I glanced at Lila with a cautionary "stay close," and we ran for the gate, sliding through the gap as the wind tugged it open. I pushed it closed behind us. It swung open again, like it always did. Pausing, I checked for potential threats in both directions. Contents of overturned garbage cans, a bloody jacket, and a kid's shoe littered the cracked asphalt of the alley to the right. To the left, at the end, was an old sedan with shattered windows. Closer, the pale arm of a corpse poked out from behind a dumpster, crushed and shredded. I waited, but it didn't move. The incessant bang, bang, bang of the gate wore on my fragile nerves. I took the time to make sure it was latched, and we turned in the opposite direction of the body. Neighbors' yards on both sides were empty and quiet. Back doors were open. No sound came from inside their homes. I wanted to believe it meant that they were somewhere safe, evacuated during the early days. I'd known many of the nearby families since I was a child, but odds were they never made it out. Not alive, anyway. The truck was 3 blocks away. Rusty wanted to approach the house from a distance to ensure the neighborhood wasn't overrun with the infected or under control of the desperate. Both were equally dangerous. As we neared the head of the alley, a man wandered into view. His blue suit was torn and soaked in bright blood. He raised a hand to his face, absently tugging at a flap of festering skin hanging from his cheek. Hearing our approach, he turned to face us head-on. We stopped. He rushed toward us, twitchy and frantic. "Help me, please. I didn't mean to. I was angry, and she wouldn't shut up. She just kept talking and talking, going on and on and on and on, and I couldn't take it. All I wanted was for her to be quiet. I couldn't take the noise. There's so much of it inside me. It's loud and never-ending," and he left off, repeatedly smacking the side of his head. "But she wouldn't listen. She wouldn't listen." I raised the weapon. "Stay back." "What? No, I'm not going to hurt you." "The blood on your clothes say otherwise." Coming to a staggering halt no more than a foot away, his glazed, red-stained eyes struggled to focus on mine. That's her blood, he grimaced, looking down at himself. I didn't mean to, he said again. She gave me no choice. She who? My wife. I killed her. I killed my wife. My pregnant wife. He broke down, trembling and sobbing. I killed my son. My own fucking son. You have to help me. I can't. It's too late. There's nothing I can do for you. Nothing anyone can do. That's not true. You can make it stop. Inching forward, he gestured at himself, the flesh on both hands discolored and rotting off the bone. You can help me. Help me. He growled, scraping at the loose skin on his face, ripping it into the meat in desperation. Lila, I said softly, watching the blood well to run and strip his jaw. Get behind me. I waited for her to move. Lifting my arm higher, I aimed for his ruined face. There is no help, no cure. Not for you, not for any of us. Now, you've got 2 seconds before I... He closed the distance, gripped the muzzle, and pressed it into the weeping flesh of his forehead. This is how you help. Please, I can't control myself. I can't make it stop, but you can. You can do this for me. You can give them justice. You can make it stop. His agitation sparking my own, I shouted, Make what stop? A violent shudder ran through his body. Foam bubbled from his mouth, pink with strings of bloody saliva. It dripped onto his shirt as he begged, I don't want to become one of those things. One of those savages.